I never really believed in haunted houses, at least not in the way movies make them out to be. Creaky floorboards, cold drafts, flickering lights, those things have explanations. But something happened in our home that I still can't explain. And even now, years later, it unsettles me just thinking about it. It started with my eldest son, James, when he was around 8 years old. He had never been a sleepwalker before, so the first time I found him standing in the hallway in the middle of the night, swaying slightly on his heels, I assumed he had just woken up groggy from a bad dream. His eyes were open, but not really seeing. I called his name, shook his shoulder gently, and he blinked up at me, confused. I led him back to bed and didn't think much of it. Kids sleepwalk sometimes, right? But then it started happening more often. I'd wake up to the sound of something faint sometimes, just the creak of the floorboards, sometimes a soft repetitive thud. Every time, I would find James standing in the exact same spot in the hallway, facing the wall. And sometimes, he would be gently knocking his forehead against it, slow and rhythmic, like he was trying to step through it. I remember watching him one night, frozen in the dim glow of the hallway light, feeling a prickle of unease creep up my spine. It wasn't just sleepwalking. There was something about the way he moved, something deliberate, like he was drawn to that spot. I tried not to make a big deal out of it. I chalked it up to some strange quirk of his sleepwalking. But deep down, it felt unsettling. James never seemed to remember doing it in the morning. He'd wake up, completely unaware of what had happened the night before, and go on with his day like nothing was wrong. I thought it was just a phase, something he'd outgrow, but it didn't stop. It went on for months, and sometimes it was worse. I'd wake in the dead of night to find him in the hallway again, standing still, eyes wide open but vacant, his forehead gently tapping against the wall, almost in a trance. I even tried moving his bed to different parts of the room, thinking it might stop whatever pull the hallway had on him. It didn't. Then, when my younger son, Ethan, turned 8, it started again. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Kids sometimes develop the same habits, right? But the thing was, Ethan had never seen James do it. He wasn't aware of it at all. Yet, one night, there he was, in the same spot in the hallway, eyes wide open, swaying slightly, and knocking his forehead gently against the wall. I stood there in complete shock. It was exactly like James. Same behavior, same rhythm, same eerie expression. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him, frozen in place. I shook him awake, but he too didn't remember anything. This was too much to ignore now. I felt a cold chill creeping through me that had nothing to do with the weather. Something wasn't right. I became obsessed with that section of the hallway. I ran my hands over the wall, pressing against it, knocking to see if it was hollow. Nothing. It was just an ordinary wall, painted over several times through the years. But there had to be something about it, something neither of my sons should have known about, yet both were inexplicably drawn to. I even considered taking them to a doctor, worried that this might be some kind of neurological issue or shared genetic sleep disorder. But what kind of disorder makes two kids, years apart, act out the exact same unsettling ritual without ever seeing each other do it? And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Ethan's sleepwalking episodes became less frequent until one day they were gone completely. He never did it again. Just like James, life moved on. The boys grew up, left for college, and I let myself forget. I buried that sense of unease deep down, convinced that maybe I had made it into something bigger than it really was. Maybe it was all just some bizarre coincidence. Maybe I had overreacted. It wasn't until years later, when my husband and I decided to finally renovate the house, that I realized how wrong I had been. We had lived in that house for over 20 years, and it desperately needed some updates. The hallway in particular had layers of old wallpaper that we decided to strip away. I remember standing there with a scraper in hand, peeling back years of faded patterns when I hit something unexpected. Beneath the last layer, right at the exact spot where both James and Ethan had stood night after night, was a mirror. Not just any mirror, embedded mirror, seamlessly hidden behind the wallpaper. The edges were framed in dark, tarnished wood, and the glass was warped with age, cloudy but still reflective. My breath caught in my throat. I ran my fingers over the surface, feeling a strange sense of unease settle in my stomach. Why had someone gone through the trouble of covering it up like this? And more importantly, how had my sons known it was there? My husband was in the other room when I called him over. I could hear the confusion in my own voice as I tried to explain what I had found. He frowned, running his hand along the frame, knocking gently against the wall around it. "Weird," he muttered. "Why would anyone seal up a mirror like this?" That was the question that stuck with me. It wasn't just forgotten, it was deliberately hidden. Someone, at some point, had decided that this mirror shouldn't be seen. The moment I looked into it, I felt off. It wasn't just my reflection staring back at me. It was the feeling that something else was there, just beyond the glass, watching. The air in the hallway had changed, felt heavier, colder. I told my husband we needed to get rid of it. He shrugged, probably thinking I was overreacting, but he agreed. We pried it out of the wall, struggling against the nails that had held it in place for who knows how long. The second it was free, the hallway felt different, lighter, like I could finally breathe properly again. But as I wrapped it in an old sheet, preparing to haul it outside, I swore I saw something shift in the glass. Not a reflection, a movement, deep in the warped surface, like something pulling away into the darkness. I didn't say anything to my husband. Didn't want to sound crazy, but my hands were shaking as we carried the mirror outside. We left it by the curb, planning to take it to the dump the next morning. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house made my skin crawl. I kept picturing my boys, standing in that hallway, knocking their heads against the wall like they were trying to get through. Had they been drawn to something? Had something been trying to reach them? The next morning, I went outside to get rid of the mirror, but it was gone. I assumed someone had taken it, maybe a scavenger, maybe a neighbor, but the idea of someone else bringing it into their home made my stomach turn. I don't know what it was about that mirror, or why my sons had been so eerily connected to it. All I know is that since we removed it, I haven't felt that weight in the house anymore. The air feels clean. The hallway is just a hallway. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that glass, it's still out there. For weeks after the mirror disappeared, I tried to push it out of my mind. Life went on as usual, quiet, uneventful, but every so often, I'd catch myself staring at that section of the hallway, half expecting to see something shift in the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just paranoia, leftover nerves from an unsettling experience. But then, one night, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in years, a soft, rhythmic thud. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering. It was coming from the hallway, the exact same spot. For a long moment, I just sat there, frozen, listening. My sons were long gone off at college, miles away, so I knew it couldn't be them. Slowly, I got up, my hands trembling as I reached for the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, but I could still hear it. That steady, gentle thud, like a forehead knocking against the wall. I stepped into the hallway, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. The air felt wrong again, thick, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. The sound was right in front of me now, coming from the exact spot where the mirror had been. But there was nothing there, just the wall. I reached out, pressing my hand against the surface, half expecting to feel something beneath it, some hidden vibration, a pulse, anything to explain the noise. But it was just a wall, solid, cold. The knocking had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting, watching. I backed away, my skin crawling, and rushed back to bed, pulling the covers over me like a child afraid of the dark. I barely slept that night, too afraid to close my eyes, terrified that if I did, I might wake up standing in that hallway, knocking my own forehead against the wall. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. Maybe I'd imagined the knocking, half awake, still haunted by the memories of my son's sleepwalking. But as I passed the hallway on my way to the kitchen, I stopped cold. The wallpaper, the same section we had stripped away weeks ago, had a faint smudge right at forehead level, like someone had been pressing against it. I ran my fingers over the spot. The smudge wasn't dust or dirt. It was oily, the kind of mark skin leaves on glass. My stomach dropped. Glass, a mirror. It was as if the imprint of my son's foreheads had somehow returned, even though the mirror itself was gone. I felt sick, my mind racing with explanations I didn't want to believe. My husband walked in, asking why I looked so pale, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. He had never felt what I had, never sensed the way the house seemed to breathe around us. If I told him, he'd laugh it off. And if he didn't, he believed. Me, what then? What could we do? That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, listening. Every creak of the house made my skin prickle. I told myself over and over that it was just an old home settling, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I was waiting for that sound again. And then it came, a soft, rhythmic thud. I gripped the sheets, my body rigid. It was fainter this time, as if it were coming from behind the wall instead of in front of it. My breath hitched. That wasn't possible. There was nothing back there, just insulation and wood. But the knocking continued, steady and patient, like something was trying to remind me it was still there. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, refusing to get up and look. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in fear, but eventually the knocking faded. And this time, I wasn't sure if that was a relief or a warning. The next morning, I forced myself to check the hallway again. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, maybe another smudge, another sign that something had been there in the night. But the wall was clean, perfectly normal. The only thing out of place was the overwhelming sense of unease coiling in my stomach. I went about my day in a daze, distracted and on edge. Every time I passed that section of the hallway, I felt a pull, like something was drawing my eyes to it. I refused to acknowledge it, but as the sun set and the house grew quiet, dread crept over me again. I knew it would happen again. And sure enough, sometime past midnight, the knocking returned. This time, it was different. It didn't stay soft. It grew louder, more insistent. A steady thump-thump, like something pressing harder, desperate. My heart pounded in my chest as I threw the covers off and stepped into the hallway, unable to stop myself. As I stood there in the dim light, my breath caught in my throat. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was right in front of me, just beyond the wall, as if something was on the other side. My fingers trembled as I reached out, hesitating before pressing my palm flat against the surface. The moment my skin touched it, an icy chill shot up my arm. Then, the knocking stopped. Silence swallowed the house. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen but undeniably there. I couldn't move. I just stood there, my hands still on the wall, waiting, bracing for something to happen. And then, right beneath my palm, the wall gave a tiny, imperceptible shudder, like something breathing, like something waiting for me to push further. I yanked my hand away, stumbling back so fast I nearly lost my footing. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The wall had moved. Not a lot, just the faintest, almost imperceptible shift beneath my touch, but enough for me to know I hadn't imagined it. Something was there. Something had always been there. I don't remember how long I stood frozen in that hallway, staring at the spot where the mirror had once been. My body screamed at me to run, to wake my husband, to do something, but I couldn't. I felt trapped in that moment, held in place by the awful certainty that whatever had been behind that glass all those years ago, it had never really left. The knocking, my son sleepwalking, the feeling of being watched, did all lead back to this. And now that I had acknowledged it, now that I had touched it, I was terrified I had invited it back. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected to hear the knocking, again or worse, to wake up standing in the hallway, my forehead pressed against that cursed spot on the wall. But the house remained silent. That was almost worse. It felt like whatever was there was waiting, biding its time. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't live with that wall anymore. I didn't care if it was paranoia. If it sounded ridiculous, I needed it gone. I told my husband I wanted to renovate that part of the house, maybe open up the wall to create more space. He raised an eyebrow at the sudden urgency, but shrugged it off, agreeing to help me tear it down. I didn't tell him the real reason. I didn't tell him that I knew deep down in my bones that there was something behind that wall, and I wasn't sure I could live another day knowing it was still there, waiting for someone else to find it. We started the demolition that afternoon. My husband handled the first few swings with the sledgehammer, breaking through the old drywall with ease. Dust filled the air, and for a while, it felt like any other home renovation project. Loud, messy, but ultimately harmless. But then, as he peeled away a section of the wood framing, I saw it. Another layer. Not drywall, not insulation. Glass. My breath hitched. It was old and clouded, just like the mirror we had removed, but larger, stretching from floor to ceiling. My husband stepped back, frowning. "What the hell?" he muttered, running a hand over the surface. It was embedded deep within the structure, as if the house had been built around it. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a normal mirror. It hadn't been hung up and forgotten. It had been sealed in. Before I could stop him, he lifted the sledgehammer again and swung it hard against the glass. The sound it made wasn't right. It didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. Instead, it rang out, a deep, hollow vibration that made the hairs on my arms stand up. And in the reflection, just for a split second, I saw something move. Not us, not a trick of the light. Something else, something behind the glass. I staggered back, my mouth going dry. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, just dust shifting in the air. But deep down, I knew better. My husband must have sensed something was off too, because he hesitated, gripping the sledgehammer tighter. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. I couldn't answer. I was too busy staring at the mirror, heart pounding in my ears. The dust had begun to settle, and now the reflection was clearer. The hallway behind us, the torn-up wall, my husband standing beside me, and then, just beyond his shoulders, something else. A shape, a figure. It was faint, barely more than a shadow, but it was there, watching, waiting. And then, as I stared, it shifted. Not like a trick of the light, not like dust settling. It moved with purpose. I grabbed my husband's arm, yanking him back. "We need to stop," I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. Right now, my husband looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But something in my expression must have unsettled him, because he lowered the sledgehammer. "What's wrong?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I was too fixated on the mirror. The reflection still showed us the hallway, the torn drywall, but the figure was gone. Or so I thought. Then I saw it. The faintest smudge, right where my sons had once pressed their foreheads against the wall. Only this time, it wasn't just a mark. It was a handprint, not ours, something else's. And worse, it was on our side of the glass now. A wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "We have to cover this up now." I didn't care how crazy I sounded. I didn't care if my husband thought I was overreacting. Every instinct in my body screamed that we had done something wrong, that breaking through the wall had disturbed something that should have stayed buried. And now, we had its attention. I scrambled for the tarp we had used to cover the floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the fabric. My husband was still staring at the mirror, his expression unreadable. "It's just an old mirror," he muttered, more to himself than to me. But his voice lacked conviction. He had seen it too. He just didn't want to admit it. I didn't argue. I just threw the tarp over the glass, desperate to block the reflection. The moment it was covered, the air in the hallway seemed to shift like a weight had lifted, or like something had stepped back. I exhaled a shaky breath, willing myself to calm down. But even with the mirror hidden, I could still feel it. That same thick presence, lingering just beyond the veil, watching, waiting. "We seal this up," I said, my voice hoarse. "We don't touch it again." My husband hesitated, then gave a short nod. We worked in silence, replacing the drywall, covering every inch of that cursed glass until it was gone. By the time we finished, the house felt normal again, lighter. But I knew better. It was still there, and now it knew we knew. That night, I barely slept. Even though the wall was repaired, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that we had done something we couldn't take back. Every noise in the house made my skin crawl. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the wooden floors. But what unsettled me most was the silence, the absence of knocking. For years, it had been there, faint but persistent, a presence lingering just out of reach, announcing itself in small, eerie ways. But now, nothing, not a single sound. It felt deliberate, like whatever was behind that mirror had finally gotten what it wanted. Or maybe it didn't need to knock anymore. Maybe now it was listening. I stayed awake until the first light of morning crept through the blinds, convincing myself that if I just lasted until sunrise, the house would feel normal again. But as I passed the hallway on my way to the kitchen, something made me stop. The wall, the one we had just rebuilt, looked untouched, pristine, except for one thing, a single, faint smudge at forehead height. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. It hadn't been there last night. I was sure of it. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, my fingers hovering over the spot but too afraid to touch it. And then, in the quiet of the morning, when the house should have been empty and still, a soft, deliberate knock came from inside the wall. I never touched that hallway again. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that sealing up the mirror put an end to whatever had been lurking behind it. But even after we covered the wall, even after I swore to myself that I would never acknowledge it again, the house never felt the same. I never heard the knocking again, but I felt it. The air in that hallway always seemed heavier, colder, like stepping into a space that didn't quite belong to the rest of the house. I avoided walking past it at night. Even during the day, I caught myself glancing at that spot, half expecting to see another smudge appear out of nowhere. I never told my husband how much it still haunted me, but I think he knew. He stopped questioning why I left every light on at night, why I refused to linger near that part of the house. Years passed. We grew older, and the memory of that hidden mirror faded into something almost surreal, like a bad dream I had forced myself to forget. But every so often, when I was alone in the house, I would get that feeling, again that unbearable sense that something was just on the other side, waiting, not knocking, not trying to break through, just waiting. And the worst part, sometimes, when I walked down that hallway too quickly, I could swear I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the corner of my eye. But the mirror was gone, wasn't it? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind, the way fear lingers long after the real danger is gone. But deep down, I never truly believed that. The house had never let me forget. The final straw came last winter. My husband had gone out of town for a few days, and I was alone in the house. I kept myself busy, avoiding that hallway like always, pretending everything was normal. But on the second night, as I passed by on my way to bed, I felt it again, that pull, that undeniable sense of being watched. I told myself not to look. I knew better, but I did anyway. And there, just for a second, only long enough for my brain to register it, I saw my reflection. In the wall, not in a mirror, not in a window. In the solid drywall we had put up all those years ago, my own face, staring back at me from a surface that should have been nothing but painted plaster. And the worst part, it wasn't moving with me. It stood perfectly still, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if it had been watching me this whole time. I don't remember running. I don't remember how I got to my bedroom, or how long I sat there, shaking, too afraid to move. But that was it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay in that house anymore. We sold it a few months later. I never told the new owners. Maybe that makes me a bad person, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud. I just wanted to leave it behind. But even now, in a different house, in a different town, I still hesitate before walking past mirrors in the dark. I still get the urge to cover them, to turn them away from me. Because what if it wasn't just that mirror? What if it was never about the mirror at all? What if it was about me?